Check, check. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of the Heartwood Stream Series. My name is Dan Pierce. I am the director of the Heartwood documentary series and also host of this show. I haven't done one of these live streams in a while. I've been really busy on some other projects, but this is a really special occasion, and this is actually the very first live conversation that I have ever hosted. Normally, I pre-record the interview components, but today I found some new technology that will allow me to do this live. So what we've got going on here today is a live film screening of my new short film, Waterlogged, which was crowdfunded by people just like you who may be watching this stream right now, who supported our GoFundMe campaign back in the summer, and that enabled me to take a journey out through the interior of British Columbia. I'm seeing thumbs up in the chat, so I'm glad to hear I'm coming through all right. But anyway, so that crowdfunding campaign allowed me to travel through the interior and visit places like Peachland, Grand Forks, the Slocan Valley, and up north of Revelstoke, interviewing residents and experts all along the way, all about issues pertaining to BC forestry throughout the interior of the province, looking at issues regarding logging in community drinking watersheds, logging in caribou habitat, as well as looking at some positive examples of truly sustainable ecological forestry practices that are an example of what's possible. And so I'm sitting on a mountain of footage, and just a little bit of background on this film that I'm about to show today, Waterlogged. I hit the ground running in January when I got an email from a film festival in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, called the Jackson Wild Film Festival, and they're doing a special film showcase on forests in partnership with the UN Development Program. And they asked me if I had a film to show, and I had a bunch of footage that I hadn't even started editing yet, but I knew that in there was a great short film, and so I got to work, and I chose to focus on the story of the Grand Forks floods that have occurred in recent years. 3 times in the past 4 years, Grand Forks has experienced higher than average flooding. And then in 2018, they had one really devastating flood that absolutely inundated the town, turned people's lives upside down. And you'll get to see what that looked like in the film itself. And the film also then goes into the watershed with some local, with a local logger, Stan Swinarchuk. We actually see the degradation of the watershed, and then connect that back to people's lives and the true human costs of the poor forest management that we're seeing across BC. And the film follows primarily Jennifer Houghton and her story, and how she has been impacted by these floods, as well as how she has been activated by them into a staunch forest advocate. And after the screening, it's just a 10-minute film, so we're going to get that going in just a minute. I'm not going to talk too much longer, but after the film, we're going to come back, and I've got in the waiting room Jennifer Houghton herself, the star of the film, and member of the Boundary Forest Watershed Stewardship Society, who's here to talk about the good work that she's been doing, and Herb Hammond, who is a professional forester and forest ecologist, who is also in the film and is going to expound upon some of the very fascinating topics that he lays out in the film. And we're going to keep that conversation going and get way more in depth than a 10-minute film allows us to do. That's about all I'm going to say about it right now. And without further ado, I bring to you my new short film, Waterlogged.
Normally, warm spring weather is something to celebrate, but in parts of BC's southern interior, it has unleashed destructive floods, the worst in 70 years.
The city of Grand Forks was the hardest hit of 24 communities that declared states of emergency over the last few days. It sits where the Granby and Kettle Rivers meet, and both are expected to surge again.
These are the sandbags from 2020. Tried to protect my house again. It didn't really work that well. 2017, I had 1.5 feet of water in my house. 2018, I had 4 feet of water in my house. The water was up to here in the house in 2018. The flood of 2018 was a shock to the community. People were not prepared. The city and the regional district, they weren't prepared.
3 days after the water rushed into this neighborhood, more than 100 homes still sit submerged.
Nearly 3,000 people remain under evacuation order.
This is the Kettle River. It was massively fast and powerful during the 2018 flood. A lot different from this peaceful, calm little stream that it looks like right now.
2 days ago, this is how downtown Grand Forks looked. Even at those businesses that were lucky enough to stay mostly dry, it's all hands on deck today.
We're just trying to keep it dry so we can open up eventually. But who knows? This might ruin us and a lot of other people, I think.
I don't even know what words to use to describe this right now.
This is way bigger than just the Grand Forks flood of 2018. This is something that's BC-wide, and it's going to have long-term consequences. When I saw what was happening to the community in 2018, when I saw friends and neighbors and the shock that they were going through, I thought this is a story that needs to be told. So within a few days, I started filming a documentary. So can you tell me how you felt when you first saw this? I was just devastated. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to make a documentary, if I'm going to tell our stories, I'd better find out what was the cause of the flood. I assumed, like a lot of people, that the BC government was taking care of our forests in a sustainable way. I had lived in the Slocan Valley and I knew that they were logging, but I traveled mostly on the main roads, so I didn't see the extensive clear cuts. The winter of 2017-2018, there was high snowpack in the mountains above here in our watershed, and we also had a lot of heat in April of 2018. So there was sort of a combination of factors, but people in town who are loggers started telling me that it's the clearcut logging in our watershed. A watershed is all the streams and landforms and the underground water flow that flows into a drainage basin. Our drainage basin is the Granby and the Kettle River, and our watershed is 8,000 square kilometers of forests. When those trees are removed from the landscape, when they're clear cut off the landscape, there just isn't enough trees and vegetation and intact forests to hold the water the way it used to.
What's happening in the boundary country is scary. It scared the hell out of me because there's nobody looking after it. They're just running it into the ground.
Somebody referred me to Hammond, who's a forest ecologist living in the Slocan Valley. So he was generous enough to do an interview with me.
If you fly over the Kettle River watershed, you're left with your mouth hanging open. It's incredible the amount of clear-cut logging that has occurred there. What happens in this watershed now, in those clear cuts and young forests, up until the time they're probably 70 or 80 years old, most of that precipitation that used to be moved across this landscape, that stays put as snow. And in the spring, because it's directly exposed to sunlight, it melts about 30% faster. So you have 30% deeper snowpacks that melt 30% faster. That creates spring floods and fall droughts.
We've had greater than average flooding here in the past 3 out of 4 years. And it's a combination. Yeah, climate change is a contributor. Climate change isn't going away. Clear-cut forestry is the one factor that we can actually control. We can't control how much snow is coming down. We can't control how hot it's going to get here in April, but we can control how many trees we're taking off the landscape.
We're looking at a severe cut block. This block is roughly 1,200 and some odd hectares. What you have here now is no retention, and hence you're going to get lots of floods and lots of silt and gravel and sand in the watersheds. Yeah, that's pretty massive, eh? It's like one guy says, it's Armageddon.
Industrial forestry, the way we do it, is completely incompatible with maintaining water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. There's no way around that.
It's not that we're anti-logging. The point is that we want our forests to be managed in a different way, so that we're still, as a community, reaping economic benefits, but we're not doing so much damage.
At times, firefighters had to swim through the water, polluted with toxic chemicals and sewage.
Oh my goodness.
This is the first time Kyle and Jaylee Piper have seen inside the home where they lived with their 11-year-old daughter.
My daughter's room's destroyed. This is the neighborhood of North Ruckle, and it was hit really hard by the flood. All of this neighborhood, there's about 100 houses total that are being demolished and making way for flood infrastructure. So about 100 people, about 100 families had to find new places to live.
It's like somebody come along and hit you with a baseball bat in the side of the head. I mean, it's a shock, right? And you go down on your knees. What do? I got no more house. I got a mortgage to pay, and they're tearing down my house.
The city received about a $50 million package, including funding from the federal and provincial governments. It's for flood mitigation and home buyouts, but it's under the condition that the homes are assessed at what they're worth after the floods, which in many cases isn't very much. In Watson's case, her property was valued at $150,000 before the flood hit.
Well, they're only offering me $40,000. That's a $110,000 loss. I don't have another 25 years to do it all over again.
I got flooded again in the spring of 2020, even though once again I was prepared. I had sandbagged my house, but I got a few inches of water in there. So going through flooding 3 times in 4 years, the emotional impact, it was traumatizing. I've had a lot of nights where I cry myself to sleep, where I felt incredibly alone, and I'm tired. I'm exhausted, and I'm at the point now where I just want to move on. It's a bittersweet to be leaving this property. I'm exhausted from it, and in a way I just want to snap my fingers and be done and move on with my life. At the same time, this was what I thought my future was. I thought this was going to be my forever home, and so it's kind of sad because I feel like I'm being forced to leave the place that I had planned on making my forever home. What's driving me and what's keeping me hopeful in a big way is the connections and the solidarity that I've experienced. It really does make me hopeful when I talk to loggers and union reps who say, yeah, we need this change. We're all seeing it and we're all going to start to work together. I would like the legislation in forestry to be changed so that the #1 priority is ecosystem health. Right now, the #1 priority is corporate profits, because that's who benefits right now. That needs to switch to ecosystem health, and that's going to protect the people as well. The other thing that I would like to see is that there's a decentralization of decision-making when it comes to forests, and that people who live in the frontline communities have some decision-making power around the management of the forests. And of course, that includes Indigenous people too. Indigenous communities have to be able to have a say in what's happening on the land. Everybody in local communities needs to start to come together. We need to shift the conversation. Loggers and environmentalists need to start talking to each other and realizing that we're all aiming for the same things. We've got to move forward. We've got to move ahead. Our lives depend on it.
All right, and we are back. And yeah, that was waterlogged. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in early enough to catch the whole thing. But for those of you who maybe showed up late and only caught the second half of the film or something, I will be sure to play it one more time at the very end. So if you didn't catch the whole thing or you only catch the last few seconds, I will play it at the end. And of course, the film will be posted in its entirety in the comments so that you can share it and you know, watch it in your own good time. Okay, so now we are going to move on to the discussion part of this show. So this is where things get interesting. So I'm going to unmute Jennifer and Herb's mic and bring them in. First of all, let's bring in Jennifer. Hello, Jennifer. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. And now I'll just bring in Herb. And there you are. Herb, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay, fantastic. Awesome. So, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here today. And thank you for being part of this documentary. Jennifer, first of all, thank you so much for just being willing to get in front of the camera and speak. You just did such a fantastic job. You're incredibly articulate, and you know, your story is just absolutely devastating. Can't imagine what you've been through, and yeah, it just takes a lot of courage to get in front of a camera and be vulnerable like that. So I really appreciate it. Yeah, Herb, thank you as well for being part of this project and sharing your wisdom and expertise with us. I'm excited to chat with you both more today. So first of all, just to get into the just to start off the conversation, Jennifer, I'll start with you. Why don't you kind of bring us up to speed on what you've been working on over the past year and this new report that you just launched, which is called A Brighter Future for Boundary Forests. Yeah, give us a sense of what this report is about, the issues that it's addressing, who was involved in making it, and just the effort that's gone into it. And I should also just say that both of our guests are coming from rural BC, where internet service is patchy at best. So if anyone drops out, we'll just bring them right into the chat, right back into the chat, just like we did there, and we will plow ahead. And that is the part of the glory of live streaming. So Jennifer, let's start with you. Tell us about your report and a little bit of the story behind it and what it covers.
The report is a product that was created by the Boundary Forest Watershed Stewardship Society. Our team, our nonprofit, created it. And it's the first phase of a 3-phase project. And the ultimate goal of the project is to implement nature-based planning or nature-based forestry in our watershed that is supported by or managed by a community forest board that's composed of local people. So we want the system of forest management in our watershed to shift to focus on ecosystem integrity and focus on ecosystem resilience, and to give local people a say in what's happening in the land, in the land base that affects us. And so it was a huge undertaking for our society, our nonprofit, to get the funding for it, and then to create phase 1, which is the report. And so it's actually 2 reports. We've got a main report, which talks about the direction that we want to go, the problems, and then the direction that we want to go. And then we've got our field report. And you guys saw Stan Swinarchuk in the video. So Stan and Wayne Tibloose are 2 of the retired loggers in our group, and they spend countless hours traveling our watershed. They know the watershed like the back of their hands. And so we visited, I think it was 12 sites with Stan and Wayne. And in the field report, we looked at the good, the bad, and the really bad in our watershed. And we examined what was going on in those sites. So for example, we looked at some clear-cut logging sites where there's white bark pine growing, and there's blocks that include white bark pine, which is an at-risk and rare species and is supposed to be protected, but the blocks are marked for logging. We also looked at a woodlot in our watershed where the woodlot owner is doing selection forestry, and it looks completely different from a clear cut. We also explored some logging blocks that Stan and Wayne had been involved in back in the 90s, and they did small scale selection logging. And we go back to those forests now where they had preserved clumps of trees for mule deer, for example, and it looks like a forest. It functions like a forest. So that's our field report, and it bears witness to what's happening in our watershed right now. And then we've got our main report. It's a 172-page report, and we go through impediments to our goals. And so the impediments to our goal, nature-based planning supported by a community forest board, the impediment to our goal is the forest system, this current outdated paradigm that's supported by legislation. Legislation has got to be changed. And then we talk about the costs of the current system on our community. And that includes the flood. It includes wildlife species that are at risk, the extinction threats that happen because they're losing their habitat to clear-cut logging. And then we talk about our new path forward, the proposal that we're making, which is to have things run under a new paradigm. And the new paradigm is based in nature's needs, and it's based in ecological integrity, and it's based in community economies. And so this phase is done. We're putting it out to the public now. We're sharing it with other communities. We're sharing it with all levels of government. We really would like our local government and regional government to get on board with this and to push for it. And we're going to propose to the province that they implement a pilot project in our watershed based on nature-based planning and a community forest board. So we've got a lot of work to do. Phase 2 would be designing those two elements. And when it comes to nature-based planning, Herb Hammond is the expert, so I'll let him speak more on that topic.
Jennifer, thank you so much. Yeah, I really got to commend you on the report. I looked over it over the last couple of days. I read the executive summary. I've started reading the report, but I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet. It's, 180 pages, very in-depth, and plus the whole field report. So tons to go through. And while it is called, while it is a report on the boundary watershed in particular, honestly, it really is relevant to everyone in BC. What's happening in the boundary is a microcosm of what's happening all across the province, and I think you've just done fantastic work. I know you've worked super hard on that. So let's go to Herb now. Herb, are you with me? Uh-oh. Herb might have froze up on us here, but that's okay. I'm sure we will. I'm just going to exit him out here, and I'm sure he'll dial back in a second here. Oh, there he is.
All right.
Hello. All right, you're back. Great.
Okay, I'm back.
Perfect. Yeah, that was like such a good recovery. All right. So Herb, what I wanted to ask you was, because of the nature of a short film, your voice or your section had to get shortened down to the bare minimum to kind of get the point across in a limited amount of time. But I wanted to sort of like get you to kind of like expand upon, one of the main focus of the film is the connection between logging, clear-cut logging in particular, and flooding. And so I was wondering if you could sort of like pick up on what you said in the film and maybe just expound a little bit upon how intact forests maintain water flows on the landscape and how clear-cutting negatively impacts or disrupts those processes.
Okay. Let me, I think when you mentioned that Jennifer's group report was applicable all across BC, I completely agree with that. I like the report. I think there's a lot of good stuff there. But let me tell you a really kind of basic story about intact forests. And it's probably most graphically understood by starting on the west coast of North America, or in our case, the west coast of British Columbia. Remembering that when rain or snow moves inland and falls on a forest, at least 40% of it is evaporated or sublimated back into the atmosphere and moves somewhere else. That process leapfrogs precipitation literally across the continent and is responsible for precipitation eventually on the prairies. Well, when you cut holes in that intact forest landscape, suddenly all that 30 or 40% of precipitation stays put. It no longer leapfrogs across the continent. And that has both landscape or continental effects of changing water relations, making some areas drier and more susceptible to drought. But if we're talking about the boundary or a specific watershed, you now have in snow-dominated ecosystems, you have snowpacks that are 40% deeper than under an intact forest. They're also directly exposed to solar radiation in the spring, so they melt 30% faster. And that's a simple but really clear recipe for floods in the spring and droughts in the fall. And the interesting thing as if you trace how that effect continues, as you progress, as clear cutting expands in a watershed, flooding becomes not only more frequent, higher peak flows or floods, but the magnitude of those floods goes up as well. So as clear cutting proceeds, you have more frequent floods and bigger floods. And that's exactly what came together in 2018 and after, before and after in Grand Forks.
All right. Thank you very much, Herb. You know what, Herb, I'm going to toss another question at you because I feel like I want to sort of pick up the thread from where Jennifer left off. And then, Jennifer, I'm going to come back to you in a second. Herb, a huge focus of Jennifer's report and her group's report, the Boundary Watershed Stewardship Society's report, talks about nature-based planning or nature-based forestry. And you are a very notable and renowned practitioner in, I guess, what I would call, or what you would call ecosystem-based conservation planning. Are these two things the same thing? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what nature-based planning means to you, what it looks like on the ground, and what guides your thinking in this type of forestry and landscape planning.
Okay, well, ecosystem-based conservation planning and nature-based planning are really synonymous. The evolution of...
Whoop. And we got another dropout. That's okay. I'm sure Herb will be back any second, and we'll let him finish what he's saying. Yeah. Oh, there he is. Boom. Sorry about that, Herb. We got you back there.
Okay.
Yeah.
No,
just carry right on with what you were saying.
Okay. Well, ecosystem-based conservation planning and nature-based planning are synonymous. I've been working on this concept for more than 40 years. I know a lot of the credit to developing these ideas around Indigenous ways of being and Indigenous knowledge that was shared to me by Indigenous people across Canada and elsewhere in the world, as well as connecting it to good Western science. So what it simply means is that you focus first on what to protect and then on what to use. And what to protect are fully functioning ecosystems and the landscapes that hold them at all scales of space, small to big, big to small, through time. That's a simple statement, but then putting it into practice means designing networks of ecological reserves at multiple spatial scales. So you start with a watershed like the Kettle would be a good place to start, and you designate sub-watersheds within the Kettle that are large protected areas. They form the core of biological diversity. They provide connectivity throughout the watershed from high elevations down to lower elevations. And most importantly, they provide a natural blueprint for us to be able to study as we do things in other parts of the watershed, so that if we foul something up, we've got a plan, a natural plan that we can go look to figure out how to right the wrongs. And then so from those big protected areas, you link them together so that for wide-ranging animals like grizzly bears and caribou, animals like that, they have a way of moving through that landscape. And then in the other sub-watersheds, you design protected networks that we call protected landscape networks, which have similar components. They protect areas of old growth. They protect all the riparian ecosystems or wet forests adjacent to streams, creeks, lakes. They have ecologically sensitive areas. So if you have steep areas or very dry or very wet areas, they're protected with buffers. And so when you're done at that second scale, you have something that looks like Swiss cheese, where you can think of the holes in the Swiss cheese as being places that are potential for various extractive human uses, in particular, in this case, timber management. But before that decision is made, at that stage in planning, there's a community process that kicks in where people look at those potential human use areas and decide how to use them. They may be culturally important for indigenous nations, and that use would be deferred to the indigenous people. They may be important for cultural uses of settler communities, and again, could be deferred for that reason. And they may, the human use conversation in the community may say, no, this is a good place to do forestry. Okay, if that's the case in various areas throughout that the plan, then in those specific areas, you do the third and final level of networks of ecological reserves, which we call protected ecosystem networks. And there you want to make sure you leave clumps of old trees. You want to leave fallen trees, which are habitat for a lot of insects and amphibians like salamanders. They also provide habitat in the winter for animals like marten. And, oops.
You're still there. Oh, there you go. All right. Oh, you're there. You're still there.
Oh, okay. I'm still here.
Yeah,
okay.
You're still there.
And so just to finish that.
All right. We're going to come back to Herb in a second. And Jennifer, I'm going to go to you. Having looked at the executive... Oh, there's Herb back. All right. And Herb, yeah. I'm just going to turn to Jennifer. Do you mind holding that thought, and I'll just come back to you in a minute? And yeah, or do you want to finish? Let me
just add one thought here.
Sure, no problem.
So at that fine scale of networks, then you designate full cycle trees that stay there forever, and they define what trees you can cut in a forest management standpoint. And that's what fuels community-based forestry and small-scale value-added manufacturing. So the conclusion of the story is that from those large protected areas through watershed networks of protected areas to full-cycle trees that stands, you have continuous forest cover. So you get the benefits of the forest and provide benefits to the community. And there will be plenty of community benefits, but there's not enough benefits for the greed of corporate forestry.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Herb. And Jennifer, I would say that two of the biggest issues that we're facing in BC's forests today stem from issues around values, what we choose to value, what we are currently choosing to value in terms of our current forest paradigm, and there being a disconnect between what I think most people across the province value and what is currently being valued by the industry and by government above all else, which is timber value and corporate profit. But of course, there are so many other values that stem from our forests, intact forests, healthy forests, for communities, for workers. So there's the question of values, and then I think there's the question of control, which is who is in control, who is making these decisions. And so I'm going to just sort of turn that over to you. I know that's a little bit ambiguous, but could you talk about your conception of where we're at right now with values in BC and what our current forest industry values and what you feel we should be valuing and how that should really be guiding the policy changes that we're advocating for. And maybe then we can sort of pick up with that conversation about who's in control and how we take back control.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot. So, when you look at BC government websites, when you look at forest lands and natural resources, the Flynn Roard web pages, they use the word sustainability a lot. And I was really fortunate to work with retired professional forester Ray Travers on this report. He was our content advisor, and he talked a lot about the different paradigms of sustainability. So when the BC government talks about sustainability, that's something different than most of us think about sustainability. And what we discovered in the writing of this report is that even in the sense that the BC government looks at something as sustainable, the current forestry system isn't sustainable. So what industry and government are trying to sustain is the industry itself. They're trying to, and they do that by attempting to sustain a constant supply of timber. And they're actually just blatantly calling it fiber these days, which is a pretty disgusting way to refer to our life support. Anyway, so they're interested in maintaining this constant supply of fiber in order to support corporate profits. And there's a lie in that. The BC government is saying that they're also sustaining jobs, and that's not true, because at this point, it's the forest industry only provides 1.9% of the jobs in British Columbia. It's such a minute amount of jobs. So what are they actually sustaining? They're not sustaining anything, and they're certainly not sustaining the economic value of our forests. There's this concept, it's termed the fall down effect, and that's another thing that a lot of wise folks like Herb and Ray Travers have taught me. And so BC forests, before the settlers came, they were developing for centuries. And we had these mature and old forests that provided us with benefits and services, managing our climate for us, managing our water for us. And then, the colonial settlers came along, and they viewed the old and mature forests as this gift. So nature gave us this gift. It took centuries to develop. And they decided that the way to benefit from it was this skewed, sort of odd, anti-intuitive way of viewing the forest. Let's cut down all the old growth because it's decadent, or whatever terminology they use, and let's cut that down quickly, and let's replace that with tree farm plantations. Because when we plant these tree farm plantations, we can cut them down in shorter rotations, so 35 to 70-year rotations. But the thing is, the value that they get out of those 35-year-old trees is much less than the value that they get out of the old and mature forests that took hundreds of years to develop. The value of the wood, the quality of the wood is not the same. And so what the BC forest industry is sustaining is nothing. It's zilch, zippo, nada, not jobs, not community economies, not the value of wood, not the benefits and services that we get from mature, intact forests. So, I mean, what people value are the benefits that we get out of forests, and those are being destroyed. The economic value is and we're not far away from that in the boundary. So then there's the issue of control, right? So we've got a bureaucracy in the government right now that is populated by people who are connected with Kofi. and ILMA. So those are organizations that are forest industry organizations. John Allen, who's the Deputy Minister of Forests, he's retiring. He's cycled in and out of Kofi. He's associated with Kofi. And it's these high-level bureaucrats that are making the decisions, that are influencing the elected officials. And we've got this enormously strong lobby as well from the forest industry. If you look at the record of lobbyists that the government is required to keep, Kofi lobbyists and industry lobbyists are constantly, regularly meeting with the elected officials. So who's controlling forest management in British Columbia? It's the forest industry. It's the forestry executives. It's the forestry corporations, and a lot of them are multinational corporations. And we talk about this a lot amongst ourselves. We talk about how they are logging out BC and they're investing the profits in other countries. Interfor, for example, which has a mill here in Grand Forks, they just bought a new mill in, I believe it was Georgia, somewhere in the southern US. So they're chopping down our trees, they're taking away our value, they're taking away our protection, and they are pissing off to the US, and they're investing the profits elsewhere, and jobs are in decline. So the control of British Columbia forests should be in the hands of the people. In particular, it should be in the hands of the people who are directly affected by what's happening on the land base. So when we talk about what happened in Grand Forks, we have this 8,000 square kilometer watershed. That's just the Canadian side. So the people who are impacted by what happens to that land base should have some say in it. So in our report, we talk about the creation of community forest boards, and those forest boards are composed of local people, and they would be advised by the science and supported by an expanded science branch created by the government. They would also be supported by regional ranger stations. All of that stuff got shut down around 2003. Thousands of public sector jobs were eliminated. The government switched over to professional reliance, so the industry is monitoring itself, and they're essentially left to monitor themselves. So why is industry going to make decisions based on the needs of grizzly bears when it comes to road density? They're not going to do that. They're going to make decisions based on what costs them the least and gets them the most profits. Whereas if control is put into the hands of local people, we're going to base our decisions about forest management on different things. People in British Columbia care about ecosystems. They care about ecological integrity. They care about wildlife. They care about clean water. They care about climate change. So we're going to base our decisions on those things rather than corporate profits, which are being invested in the southern US.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Herb, I just picking up on what Jennifer was just talking about there. When you look at the recent history of forestry and the not so recent history of forestry, it seems to me to be a story of decline and degradation, and especially in recent decades, where we're seeing many mill closures. Steep decline in forestry employment. I think something like 45,000 jobs lost in the last 25 years. And I feel like Herb might have just cut out again there. Let's get him back in there. I'm sure he'll be back in a second. There he is. All right. And you're back.
Okay.
So we're just talking about a decline in forestry employment, loss of something like 45,000 forestry jobs, closure of nearly half of the mills on the coast, and probably close to that all across the province. So what's causing this decline? What's causing the contraction of the industry, and how is that connected to the degradation of the forests and the ecosystems and the wildlife and all these other metrics that we're seeing in the ecological framework as well?
Well, it actually is pretty simple. It's called privatized public forests. And that privatization is facilitated by something that's called the forest tenure system, which should be more aptly called the timber tenure system. Starting in the early 1940s and accelerating after the Second World War, the BC government, for all intents and purposes, gave the rights to public forests to private institutions, namely timber companies, with the stipulation that they would make communities. They would build mills, create jobs, and that was the way of developing British Columbia / Canada's natural resources. As a sidebar, that same history occurred across this country. And it reflects, instead of a protection or a view of forests and other natural ecosystems as natural a natural inheritance for future generations, or the public interest, it sees them instead as valueless unless they're turned into dollars. That view of the public interest has not served us well. So over time, as Jennifer laid out, the Council of Forest Industries and the Interior Lumber Manufacturers Associations and similar organizations worked on government to refine the control of timber companies over this alleged public land, while at the same time the government is always saying it's all public, only it isn't all public, and as Jennifer's report and her talk outlined. So the final coup de grace for getting control happened about 20 years ago, 15 or 16 years ago, under a Liberal government, where they had tried unsuccessfully to outwardly privatize it by turning everything into what are called tree farm licenses, which are a form of tenure that has been viewed by the courts as being just next to fee simple property rights, like our private property that we might own around our home. Well, they failed on that because people were wise to that. So what they did was get rid of the Forest Service and all the regulations that required accountability for what happens in forests. And they then replaced that with this Orwellian concept called professional reliance, which simply says that all is okay in the forests if a forester or another consultant in the employ of that timber company say it's okay. They don't have to give you any standards. They don't have to give you any substantive reasons. You're just supposed to believe them that everything's okay. So you can imagine, if that's how medicine was practiced in this province, how people would react. But that's how forestry is practiced to this day. I have in the background, you can see a filing cabinet, and it's full of requests to timber companies recently for the standards they apply to protect water, to protect biodiversity, to protect local jobs, to maintain carbon sequestration and storage, which is of ultimate importance in climate change. So we're on a fast track to an abyss that we don't want to fall into. And until that tenure system is abolished and forests are truly put back into public hands and then decentralized, as Jennifer has laid out, through community forest boards governed by legislation and policy that requires the protection first of ecological integrity and biodiversity through nature-based or ecosystem-based conservation plans.
And another periodic cutout there. Get him back in here. Let him finish his thought. And I'm sure he'll be back in 5. Well, there he is. Like clockwork. We're getting good at this.
It may be welcome to the internet foibles of the Slocan Valley, too.
Yeah, well, that's live streaming for you. Why don't you finish off what you were saying there, Herb?
So, So I think I think it may have frozen before I mentioned that we have to abolish the tenure system and put back in place public control of public forests. And one of the first mechanism is to establish the legislation and policy that requires that forests are protected first for their ecological integrity and their myriad of ecosystem benefits: pure air, clean water, but biodiversity, carbon sequestration and storage, recreation, spiritual values for all of us. And then we can start thinking about those human use zones I talked about earlier, where they're located by having ecosystem-based conservation plans or nature-based plans in place. And until we get to that stage, we're hanging on a thread here of not only losing the timber industry, who's kind of like the bank robber dropping some gold as they run out the door to the US and Sweden and elsewhere, but we're also going to be left behind with no resources to pay for the restoration and the rehabilitation of the ecosystems that we depend upon.
And Jennifer, I just have one more question for you here. There's a common myth that the industry perspective, the status quo, is on the side of workers, and that environmentalists are anti-logging and anti-worker. But one of the things that you mentioned in your report is that nature-based planning and nature-based forestry does not mean fewer jobs. It could even potentially mean far greater employment and meaningful, local, sustainable, and I hate using that word, but truly sustainable in the long-term jobs that that aren't connected to the destruction and degradation of the forest, but that are connection to the healing and regeneration of the forest, as well as adding value to wood products rather than selling them at their lowest possible value, which is raw logs and dimensional lumber. So hopefully I didn't just answer the question myself, but pick up on what I'm just saying there. Like, speak to forestry workers and talk about how nature-based conservation planning or nature-based forestry does not mean fewer jobs. It could actually mean more employment, more opportunities.
Right, so the shift that we're talking about to nature-based forestry doesn't eliminate forestry jobs. It just changes the outcome of those forestry jobs. And so what we're talking about is we're talking about, in essence, cutting down fewer trees and getting more value for each tree that's cut down. And what that means is that the government, the British Columbia government, has got to shift its investment. Some people who are listening probably have read David Broadland's article where he talks about how forestry has actually been costing BC taxpayers $1 million a day, or is it $1 million a day?
I think so.
For the past.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah. 365 million.
That's very conservative too, as David would also agree.
Right. So it's costing BC taxpayers $1 million a day to sustain this unsustainable forest industry. So taxpayers are already covering the bills. So what the government has to do is it has to shift the investment of the money that it's investing in forest management and shift it into value-added manufacturing. It's got to shift it into regional log sort yards. And in those log sort yards, what's going to happen is we're going to get more value for each tree that goes through the log sort yard. Rather than focusing on volume, we focus on value. We shift from clear-cut industrial forestry to selection logging, which will involve, again, getting more value for fewer trees cut down. It involves smaller scale equipment. It might involve some more manual labor. And, there's plenty of safety protocols that people can use. Manual logging doesn't have to be dangerous like it was in 1925. So we're still talking about jobs for people in the forest industry. There's planning jobs, there's monitoring jobs, there's compliance jobs, there's sales of equipment, there's more public sector jobs are required as well. The government just has to shift where it's investing the money and how it's investing the money. We're not going to lose forestry jobs. We're probably actually going to gain more forestry jobs, and then the benefits will spread out as well. So we're not talking about an end to logging. We're not talking about an end to the forest industry. We're talking about changing the outcomes of the forest industry.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for talking to us today. And Herb, thank you so much for being here today. Herb, I'll give you the last word. Is there anything else that you want to add? Do you want to leave us off on kind of a hopeful note and, give us a sense of what's possible if our politicians find the will and the imagination to actually listen to the people and begin to make this shift? What is possible? And a lot of times the environmental movement gets accused of being depressing or just talking about the problems, but I see the reason why I've followed this for over 10 years is because this is not just about stopping something. This is about shifting to something better, and there is a positive vision here. So leave us on a hopeful note. Tell us, what's your positive utopian vision for the future, and what's possible that politicians and the public can get behind.
Well, I think that it's as simple as redefining forestry, instead of meaning timber extraction, to mean forest protection and forest restoration, and adding to that bolstering resilience for the Anthropocene or climate change era. Timber becomes a byproduct instead of the focus in that relationship. And as Jennifer has pointed out, that will produce more jobs than are currently provided by the industry. Different jobs that loggers like Stan and others that were in the film feel good about doing, because they're part of healing, part of regeneration, part of maintaining a forest. And when it comes to jobs, you can use that timber byproducts to produce, instead of less than one job per tree cut, you can produce 5 to 7 times 5 to 7 jobs per tree cut, which means you don't have to cut very much to have the same amount of employment from what we used to call timber management or that kind of forest management. So I think we have to start there, and that will lead us to getting forests back in the hands of the public. It will lead us to forest use being guided by nature-based planning, and it will lead us to communities having a large say in how that rolls out in the landscapes around them. The simple thing that has to be the impediment to that is getting rid of corporate control of forests and getting them back in the hands of the public. From my own work, I think the public is past ready for that, and we know how to do it, so let's get on with it.
Absolutely. Herb Hammond, Jennifer Houghton, thank you so much for joining me here today. Thank you for being a part of this project. I'm so grateful for your contributions, for your courage to get in front of the screen and speak, and for trusting me to do that as best I could. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to let you go here and go back to solo. And so I want to thank everyone who joined me here today, and especially everyone who contributed to the Heartwood GoFundMe campaign last summer that made this whole film possible. And for those of you who joined in late and didn't get to see the film screened earlier in the screening, I leave you with one more screening of my short film about the Grand Forks floods and the connection to forestry and climate change. here is a final presentation of Waterlogged.
Normally, warm spring weather is something to celebrate, but in parts of BC's southern interior, it has unleashed destructive floods, the worst in 70 years.
The city of Grand Forks was the hardest hit of 24 communities that declared states of emergency over the last few days. It sits where the Granby and Kettle Rivers meet, and both are expected to surge again.
These are the sandbags from 2020. Tried to protect my house again. It didn't really work that well. 2017, I had 1.5 feet of water in my house. 2018, I had 4 feet of water in my house. The water was up to here in the house in 2018. The flood of 2018 was a shock to the community. People were not prepared. The city and the regional district, they weren't prepared.
3 days after the water rushed into this neighborhood, more than 100 homes still sit submerged.
Nearly 3,000 people remain under evacuation order.
This is the Kettle River. It was massively fast and powerful during the 2018 flood. A lot different from this peaceful, calm little stream that it looks like right now.
2 days ago, this is how downtown Grand Forks looked. Even at those businesses that were lucky enough to stay mostly dry, it's all hands on deck today.
We're just trying to keep it dry so we can open up eventually. But who knows? This might ruin us and a lot of other people, I think.
I don't even know what words to use to describe this right now.
This is way bigger than just the Grand Forks flood of 2018. This is something that's BC-wide, and it's going to have long-term consequences. When I saw what was happening to the community in 2018, when I saw friends and neighbors and the shock that they were going through, I thought this is a story that needs to be told. Within a few days, I started filming a documentary. So can you tell me how you felt when you first saw this?
I was just devastated.
And then I thought, well, if I'm going to make a documentary, if I'm going to tell our stories, I'd better find out what was the cause of the flood. I assumed, like a lot of people, that the BC government was taking care of our forests in a sustainable way. I had lived in the Slocan Valley and I knew that they were logging, but I traveled mostly on the main roads, so I didn't see the extensive clear cuts. The winter of 2017-2018, there was high snowpack in the mountains above here in our watershed, and we also had a lot of heat in April of 2018. So there was sort of a combination of factors, but people in town who are loggers started telling me that it's the clearcut logging in our watershed. A watershed is all the streams and landforms and the underground water flow that flows into a drainage basin. Our drainage basin is the Granby and the Kettle River, and our watershed is 8,000 square kilometers of forests. When those trees are removed from the landscape, when they're clear cut off the landscape, there just isn't enough trees and vegetation and intact forests to hold the water the way it used to.
What's happening in the boundary country is scary. It scared the hell out of me because there's nobody looking after it. They're just running it into the ground.
Somebody referred me to Hammond, who's a forest ecologist living in the Slocan Valley. So he was generous enough to do an interview with me.
If you fly over the Kettle River watershed, you're left with your mouth hanging open. It's incredible the amount of clear-cut logging that has occurred there. What happens in this watershed now, in those clear cuts and young forests, up until the time they're probably 70 or 80 years old, most of that precipitation that used to be moved across this landscape, that stays put as snow. And in the spring, because it's directly exposed to sunlight, it melts about 30% faster. So you have 30% deeper snowpacks that melt 30% faster. That creates spring floods and fall droughts.
We've had greater than average flooding here in the past 3 out of 4 years. And it's a combination. Yeah, climate change is a contributor. Climate change isn't going away. Clearcut forestry is the one factor that we can actually control. We can't control how much snow is coming down. We can't control how hot it's going to get here in April, but we can control how many trees we're taking off the landscape.
We're looking at a severe cut block. This block is roughly 1,200 and some odd hectares. What you have here now is no retention, and hence you're going to get lots of floods and lots of silt and gravel and sand in the watersheds. Yeah, that's pretty massive, eh? It's like one guy says, it's Armageddon.
Industrial forestry, the way we do it, is completely incompatible with maintaining water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. There's no way around that.
It's not that we're anti-logging. The point is that we want our forests to be managed in a different way, so that we're still, as a community, reaping economic benefits, but we're not doing so much damage.
At times, firefighters had to swim through the water polluted with toxic chemicals and sewage.
Oh my goodness.
This is the first time Kyle and Jaylee Piper have seen inside the home where they lived with their 11-year-old daughter.
My daughter's room's destroyed. This is the neighborhood of North Ruckle, and it was hit really hard by the flood. All of this neighborhood, there's about 100 houses total that are being demolished and making way for flood infrastructure. So about 100 people, about 100 families had to find new places to live.
It's like somebody come along and hit you with a baseball bat in the side of the head. I mean, it's a shock, right? And you go down on your knees. What do? I got no more house. I got a mortgage to pay, and they're tearing down my house.
The city received about a $50 million package, including funding from the federal and provincial governments. It's for flood mitigation and home buyouts, but it's under the condition that the homes are assessed at what they're worth after the floods, which in many cases isn't very much. In Watson's case, her property was valued at $150,000 before the flood hit.
Well, they're only offering me 40. That's a $110,000 loss. I don't have another 25 years to do it all over again.
I got flooded again in the spring of 2020, even though once again I was prepared. I had sandbagged my house, but I got a few inches of water in there. So going through flooding 3 times in 4 years, the emotional impact, it was traumatizing. I've had a lot of nights where I cry myself to sleep, where I felt incredibly alone, and I'm tired. I'm exhausted, and I'm at the point now where I just want to move on. It's a bittersweet to be leaving this property. I'm exhausted from it, and in a way I just want to snap my fingers and be done and move on with my life. At the same time, this was what I thought my future was. I thought this was going to be my forever home, and so it's kind of sad because I feel like I'm being forced to leave the place that I had planned on making my forever home. What's driving me and what's keeping me hopeful in a big way is the connections and the solidarity that I've experienced. It really does make me hopeful when I talk to loggers and union reps who say, yeah, we need this change. We're all seeing it and we're all going to start to work together. I would like the legislation in forestry to be changed so that the #1 priority is ecosystem health. Right now, the #1 priority is corporate profits, because that's who benefits right now, that needs to switch to ecosystem health. And that's going to protect the people as well. The other thing that I would like to see is that there's a decentralization of decision making when it comes to forests, and that people who live in the frontline communities have some decision making power around the management of the forests. And of course that includes Indigenous people too. Indigenous communities have to be able to have a say in what's happening on the land. Everybody in local communities needs to start to come together. We need to shift the conversation. Loggers and environmentalists need to start talking to each other and realizing that we're all aiming for the same things. We've got to move forward. We've got to move ahead. Our lives depend on it.
All right, and on that note, I bid you all farewell. I probably won't be doing many of these live streams over the next little while, as I've got a lot of other work on my plate over the next 6 months or so, not necessarily pertaining to forestry stuff, but as I, when I finish another one of the films that I owe all my funders, I will be sure to do another one of these live screenings and discussions. I thought that went really well. I love the live interview format. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone who tuned in. And of course, this will be available after I finish this broadcast. So please feel free to share it far and wide. And I'll also share links in the comments to the Boundary Forestry Report, the Boundary Forest Report, and some of the other things that we mentioned in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend, and ta-ta.